recording, please. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to our fourth meeting of this work group, fourth in a 5-meeting series. Thank you all for your time and participation. We've had a lot of comments from you all in between our last 2 meetings, and we're going to spend a lot of today synthesizing those and digging in. So let me just set the stage for the conversation today, do all the normal logistics and regrouping. So next slide, please. As usual, this meeting is being recorded. The recording will be posted on the workgroup website. A transcription is available, and please keep yourself on mute until it is your turn to speak. We do not have a public comment period during this meeting. If folks want to submit public comment, they are welcome to share that via email, and we will post that online and distribute it to the group, but we will not have an open public comment period. Next slide. So I'm going to really briefly recap the 3rd meeting and what happened between the 3rd meeting and today. And then we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about the suggestions that you all have made. We asked you for input on a couple of things, and we're going to talk through that and go from there. So I have a little bit more to say about what was in those prompts, what you all said, how well that aligned or not aligned that was. But the plan is I'm going to sort of present that back to you in a synthesis, and then we'll see where you want to take the discussion. And then we do want to hold some time at the end for the plan for meeting 5, since we only have one more meeting left of this meeting series. So we'll see what we need to do between now and meeting 5 and at meeting 5 to wrap up this process. Next slide. As a reminder, the workgroup charge is to review the economic trend data and recommend to OHA what the cost growth target should be set at for 2026 to 2030, and OHA will make the final decision on the target. Next, this is our running work plan. We have covered all of the content that we meant to present, and so now we're really into discussion and iteration of various proposals with the goal to hopefully identify a draft recommendation and be able to finalize that in meeting 5. And then finally, next slide on logistics, public comment. Anyone is welcome to submit a public comment about the target, the process, the work group's recommendation between now and the end of November. And all of that will be taken into account as OHA makes its decision. So feel free to email those comments in. And thank you for everyone who's been sharing input to date. So next slide. After meeting 3, oh, wait. Are my slides out of order? Go back one, please, Melissa. Oh, weird. I'm totally missing a slide. Okay, go ahead. So, meeting 3, next slide. After meeting 3, wow, I'm sorry, I'm having way too many technical difficulties resolved. So, in meeting 3, we discussed the legislative intent and the purpose of the target. There was some disagreement about that interpretation, noted. We talked about an aspirational versus a realistic target and heard very strong input from many workgroup members that the target should be realistic and attainable. And we started talking about some guiding principles. We looked at economic data for 5 indicators, and then some for most, both historic and projected or forecasted. Next slide. After meeting 3, we provided an additional spreadsheet with a lot of additional economic data. So there were 8 additional metrics, actually more because the percent of health insurance increases for employees. Employers can be calculated multiple ways. So there was a supplemental spreadsheet that was emailed out. It is also posted on the website in meeting materials today that has all of the data for a 20-year period or as far back as possible for all of these requested indicators. Hopefully folks have had a chance to look through that. Next slide. In addition to that, we asked you all to send input on 3 potential prompts, on one or all of these prompts, depending on where you were. So first was suggested guiding principles for target selection. Second was suggested methodology for target selection. And the third was a suggested target value or values and the rationale for that. Want to acknowledge before we go any further that these categories are maybe not mutually exclusive, and what you consider a guiding principle might be, I might have interpreted more as methodology or vice versa. So, thank you all for the feedback on this. We've tried to organize it, but this is what we asked for your input on, and we got some really rich feedback for today's discussion. So, any questions about where we are in the process, what happened in the last work group, and the request between meetings before we start summarizing what we heard from you? Okay. I'm not seeing anybody raising a hand or jumping off mute, so I'm going to keep going. If that's okay. Okay. So, next slide. So, we've summarized the information that you provided. And I want to note a couple things before we get into the weeds. So, one is that no methodology versus principle versus target versus rationale, whatever. I'm not too hung up on that, but we have tried to organize a little bit. And so your comments may be slotted in maybe a different order than you submitted them. And that there's some overlap. So also want to acknowledge that some of your conflicts may be in conflict with each other. Because we didn't hear from everybody, this was not necessarily a vote count or a majority. And so there are going to be some bullet points on the following slides that one of you recommended something and one of you recommended something that's sort of in direct opposition to that. So I'm going to present that in summary so you can see that, but want to acknowledge that up front. Also want to acknowledge a couple of other things. So there were multiple comments about accountability, and we've tried to be clear that that is not in scope for this conversation, but many of you have made points that it's difficult to talk about target setting without also talking about accountability and enforcement. So just to acknowledge that those comments have been received, and I think the sense in those comments were it's difficult to have an aspirational target if there's looming enforcement or a penalty. Several of you were more direct. If the target is unrealistic, then there shouldn't be penalties. Or if aspirational targets are pursued, enforcement mechanisms should be repealed to maintain fairness. So all of that we'll take back to OHA leadership as we move your recommendation forward for the decision, but hopefully not planning on spending a lot of time on that today. Just acknowledge that that was part of the comments. Also want to acknowledge that there were multiple comments about a realistic versus an aspirational target. Is that a guiding principle? Maybe, maybe not. I think the general sense from most of your comments that we received was that the target should be realistic and attainable, maybe with some stretch. That there was okay for it to be a little bit of a stretch, but it should generally be attainable. And final note, some of you emailed your comments in this morning. Your comments are not reflected today. I apologize for that. This only includes comments received through last night. This was going to be a quick turnaround, so I know some of you have input. Feel free to chime in as we go and add anything that you've submitted that's not reflected here because we do want it to be part of the conversation today, but just didn't have time to put materials together and get those late breaking comments in. Any questions about framing before I keep going? Okay, I'm going to keep going. So I think because of the overlap, I'd like to go through like maybe the next 5 slides and then stop, and then we can discuss and sort of bounce around between them as needed. Again, just because the overlap is not totally clear cut, if that's okay. So, suggested guiding principles. Next slide. Some of the things that we heard in your comments. The target should be calculated based on current economic indicators. The target should be based on a formula. The target formula should be based on publicly available data. The target should be set in such a way to avoid unintended consequences. The target should not increase the cost of care or force existing providers out of the market. And the target should scale down over time. Next slide. Some of the comments around methodology, trying to group them again. So the majority of comments received uh, seem to prefer historic, using a historic look back period rather than a projected economic indicator, but there were several suggestions to use a projected or forecasted indicator as well. So not totally clear cut here. And you'll see in some of the subsequent slides the specific proposals. Next slide. Some additional comments about methodology. The target should factor in acuity and utilization trend. The target should account for underpayments and cost shifting. The target should incorporate healthcare input costs, especially those not under direct provider or insurer control. The target should incorporate national healthcare expenditures, national utilization, and Oregon median wage growth trends. And conversely, the target should not prioritize healthcare sector indicators to avoid creating perverse incentives. Okay, so those were all of the more like conceptual statements. Now we start getting a little bit more specific. So next slide. There were several comments that I think can be grouped under using a floating number. So the target would be pegged to something, but that something may change over time. And there were three different suggestions here. So one is to use the previous year's average growth rate. And I actually have a question about growth rate of what? Did you mean healthcare cost growth rate or a different economic indicators growth rate? So if this was your comment, please clarify. And then subtract some small percentage from that to be the target. Second would be the natural rate of growth with some sort of allowed standard deviation. And third, the target could be tied to a dynamic indicator of true cost that floats with the input. The next slide has three additional methodology options that all speak to maybe using a blended formula or a blending economic indicators. The first, a suggestion that the formula should be a composite of two or more indicators equally focused on consumer trends and healthcare cost trends. The second option, the target should consider healthcare costs and advances in technology using a blended measure based on prospective indicators. And third, the formula should be a blend of potential gross state product and something specifically tied to healthcare cost inflation like the CMS benchmark rate. Couple more specifics on the next slide. Several of you provided comments on how often the target should be revisited. Again, comments may be in conflict. The target should be revisited and set annually versus the target should be set for 5 years. So still some variation here. And then finally, just again in this brain dump back of all of your information, we asked if any of you had a specific proposal because it's always easier to talk about a straw proposal or an actual number. And so several of you said that, you suggested a formula and that the economic indicators should be plugged into that formula and then we should see what that number is so that there could be some values from that for sure. And then there were a couple of concrete proposals, one of which is in the slides. So next slide. And this proposal is from Keaton, and in the materials posted and shared, there's a full memo around this proposal. And the proposal is that the target should be set at 3.6% based on projected median wage growth. So essentially a formula that takes 85% of the projected median wage growth. But to address many of the concerns that have come up, there should be some automatic trigger points based on changes in other economic indicators. And if those trigger points are hit, then a group similar to this work group could be convened to reset the target. So I'm going to stop there. Keaton, this is your proposal. I don't know if you'd like to say anything else on this. And then I think a couple more of you, if you had specific numeric proposals that you want to put on the table, let's go there next. And then we'll open up for discussion about any and all of this.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks everyone. I enjoyed reading all the memos that got sent out along with my own earlier this week. I think one thing that I want to sort of specify here, or at least emphasize, is that I wanted to make sure that there was at least one number on the table that could be talked about, that and that it could be a real starting point for conversation. And I anticipate that one question that a lot of people will have immediately is, why 85% as a multiplier? Why not 90% or 80% or 95% or whatever? And the simple answer is that there's a little bit of art to that, and it's about, what happens if the projections are wrong? What happens if the costs come in a little bit higher than that? The idea that I had was you want some buffer there to have the best chance of meeting the projections, or sorry, meeting what I see as the legislative intent of, reducing the experience of healthcare costs for families in Oregon. The other numbers on this slide, the automatic review thresholds, um, though, I have no idea if OHA would go for this. This is simply an idea that I had about a way to, address some of these things. But the thought was, let's look at the distribution of those numbers over time. So each of those benchmarks are, I looked at data over a relevant time period. The details are in the memo, and looked for, what the usual variance is. So all of these thresholds are things that could happen that would be disruptive, but would not require a group like this or OHA to be looking at this like every single year. I do think one of these thresholds would have been hit during the last 5 years. The Medicare Advantage benchmark threshold would have been hit, I think, at the same time as the CPI West threshold was hit. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to, if people have other questions about why this, or, I'm excited to see other proposals.
Yeah, I think we have at least one other concrete proposal, but folks, if you have questions for Keaton and want to dig into this and understand the proposal fully before we move to a second proposal, yeah, Tara. Tara, you're on mute. Sorry, we haven't heard you yet.
You know what? I always say my most brilliant thoughts when I'm on mute. Do you find that too? Um, Thank you so much for the opportunity to review and consider. I really appreciated um, the thinking around setting some review thresholds where maybe we set a target for 5 years that from this vantage point looks workable, and then we have these types of events that come into place. When I was looking over those, I think they helped call out for me another distinction that I've seen as I've tried to work through this. And forgive me for not commenting this week, but some of it's taken a little time to put together until I have a coherent thought around it. But it's trying to come up with a target for all lines of business that makes sense for all lines of business. And when I'm looking over what those increases have been in the years that we're going to be reporting on soon, but have already occurred, right? And what have our increases looked like? And we can see numbers that are pretty predictable in the Medicaid space, pretty well in the Medicare space. And so when we're looking at like Medicare Advantage benchmark rates, right? But the challenge I think we have in the healthcare market is the ability for governments to control government programs like Medicare and Medicaid, make it so that costs then can balloon in the commercial space that doesn't have those same types of controls and ultimately has to occur somewhere. So when I'm looking at like what were rate increases in 2025, and we're at 3.1% in Medicaid, 3.7% in Med Advantage, but 12.2 in the commercial market for Oregon. And then I'm saying, how do I recommend a cost growth target that makes sense for all three? Or how do I look at these thresholds and have them be relevant for all of those lines of business? I start running into challenges. And I don't know that we've talked yet about setting different targets for different lines of business or how to account for that kind of cost shift. But that's the concern that's coming to my mind as I look at this or I look at some of the other ideas that have come forward.
Thanks, Tara. James and then Charlie.
Hey, thanks, Sarah. James Pye of Salem Health. We submitted a letter to our and you sent it out. I appreciate you doing that, Sarah. So I won't reissue it and go through all of that. I'm sure people can read that if they're interested. Just on this proposal one, um, uh, aside from I think we live in very, very volatile times, and I think setting a fixed target does force us down the unintended consequences path. The piece I just really wanted to highlight, and I appreciate, Keaton went straight to the heart of the matter, which is the 85% is art versus science. And I just feel we need to move away from art because art sets very aspirational targets. You just think about the amount of money that's spent in Oregon and healthcare in any given year. that 15% reduction in, for example, median wage growth, that's hundreds of millions of dollars that we're wiping now from the healthcare cost target. And there will absolutely be unintended consequences when we're setting targets that wipe hundreds of millions of dollars per year, probably $1 billion over the 5 years from the healthcare target. I think it's a very significant number. I know, Sarah, you talked before about the 3.6 came from 5% and you reduced it by 35%. It's these very art subjective factors that will have huge unintended consequences on the availability of healthcare in Oregon. Thanks.
Sorry, Charlie, I have a follow-up question for James before we get to you. James, can you be more specific? Like, are you counter proposing that instead of an art, there should be a specific formula tied to an indicator and no, like, taking percentages here or there off of anything?
No, I think what I'm saying is if whatever we set, and there's different ones out there, I think one of the proposals is looking at a mixture of wage growth and healthcare input costs historically. I think that's good. I think percentages are good. But when we then say, hey, if that number is 5%, we're going to set it at 85% of 5%. That last factor of 85% or 80% or 50% has huge $100 million impacts on the actual, where the rubber hits the road in terms of what the expenditure of those primary care providers is going to be. It's enormous. It almost circumvents and wipes out all the good work that was done in coming up with publicly available data that's based on a formula. There's now this huge overarching art piece of it. I think if Oregon spends like $40 billion in total healthcare expenditures, that difference of 85% or 4.2% is about $200 million, $300 million a year in reduced cost.
Got it. I see what you're saying. You're saying
And
the bending of the cost curve is where the impact is that you're calling out.
yeah, I think we want
Got
to
it.
bend the cost curve in Oregon. I just think we need to think very carefully about how much we are aspirationally trying to bend it versus I mean, we might be really happy if we were at 1% bending the cost curve, given the magnitude of dollars involved.
Got it. Thanks. Okay, Charlie and then Charlotte.
Thanks for the opportunity. Two things. Number one, I like generally the concept proposed here of looking at wage growth and then a percentage of that to, as we were just discussing, bending the cost curve, which again is the whole point of this program, because consumers are feeling the increasing cost of healthcare every day, and are really the ones that are bearing the brunt of paying more in premiums and out-of-pocket costs and everything else. Um, and so I think open to conversation about what that number is, the 85%, or is it lower, or is it higher? The second thing I would say is in terms of proposed automatic review thresholds, it seems to me that, I mean, all of these probably would fall under the um, a reasonable basis for exceeding the cost growth target of macroeconomic factors. So it seems like we're kind of being a little bit redundant if we're accounting for those factors in both the target itself and then also determining whether the exceeding the target is reasonable. I think we just need to do one or the other. And removing reasonable bases for exceeding the cost growth target, I know is out of scope for this conversation. So it seems like if that's not on the table, then we shouldn't also be accounting for those same things and actually setting the target itself.
Go ahead, Charlotte. Thanks, Charlie.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to have a voice, and that's important to me. So I agree that having a solid target is important. Having something measurable and achievable is important. But I also would appreciate the focus on the spirit and the intent of the cost growth target. I'm here representing small, independent medical groups as small businesses. And from my perspective, I don't always see the spirit or the intent of the cost growth target being used to support the cost growth target. And I have an anecdote in that we were originally told keep your cost growth target at 3.4%. Then in 2020, we were told the state of Oregon's going to apply a 3% cat tax. So there goes our increase. There goes a 3% increase on our overall cash. And then this year, we're trying to negotiate rates with carriers, and we're being told they can't give any more than 3.4% because of the cost growth target. And the same plan, I just received my renewal for 2026 for my employee benefits, and it's a 36% increase, which is almost $1 million to a small business of 250 employees. I'm passionate about this right now because it's not being used accordingly. The same mothership, I don't care which umbrella, the same mothership that is telling me I can't give you higher rates because it's 3.4, the state says I can't give you more than 3.4% is telling me, oh, we're going to charge you 36% more. I'm angry about it. We moved away from that plan and we had to go self-insured. It's the only option we have. It is not being used according to the spirit or the intent of assisting everyone in the healthcare arena to do what's best for the patients.
Thanks, Charlotte. Keaton.
Oh, I thought there was a cue. I want to say two things in just thoughts that occurred to me during all of that, and one is um, about the cost curve, the bending the cost curve kind of thing, and just sort of thinking about this threshold versus another threshold or something like that. I know that some of you have economics training in this room, and you might remember some dude who looks kind of like me or some person with my sort of bearing talking about dual problems and primary problems and dual problems, which is just like another way of saying like let's flip the problem on its head and approach it a different way. And one way to flip this problem on the head is like, how do you set a cost growth target that is going to bend, that you're confident is going to bend the cost curve for Oregonians? Right? Like if you set a number too high, you're almost certainly not going to bend the cost curve. If you set a number too low, you're definitely going to bend the cost curve, but with a whole bunch of unintended negative consequences. And so I think, I was really trying to sort of frame that problem in my mind and think about it that way. And I totally agree that, from a design perspective, like it isn't necessarily, we're not living in what economists would call like a first best kind of world, in terms of what the levers are that this group has to pull. The second thing that I want to say, just one of the comments made me think of this, is I am very concerned about the way that any target that gets set here is used as a friction point or a sticking point in negotiations, and not just negotiations between carriers, payers, and employers, but also between employers, employees, because I think both kinds. I mean, the healthcare market is characterized by frictionful negotiations in some ways, and one thing that I'm worried about is the extent to which, this knob that we're turning is sort of like an inverse heater knob, where the more you turn the knob down, the more you turn the heat up other places in the system. And so, it is in balancing all of that we and then ultimately OHA have a really thorny, sticky problem.
Thanks, Keaton. A lot of reactions to your comments there. Melissa, can you go ahead and bring the slides down at this point? I think that's the end of the sort of packaged content. I know we have at least one more concrete proposal with numbers that came in this morning. So, Kirsten, can I turn to you to talk through Proposal 2.
Sure. And my apologies for not getting my homework done sooner, so it could have been on the slide. I too was thinking along the lines of median wage growth and using that to inform a target. And I will say on the outset that like what I was looking for in a target formula was rooting back like I think my guiding principles, which I think are rooted in the statute, are really around bending this cost curve for consumers. And so that the growth of healthcare spending shouldn't continue to outpace the growth of people's, employers, and the state's ability to afford healthcare. So that sent me in the direction of looking at both median wage growth for Oregonians, um, and I think looking at and inflation, general inflation. So we have what people are paid and the cost of goods that they are purchasing overall, not healthcare specific. I think I chose a historic to last 5 years because it's known, it's measurable, it doesn't have the same fluctuation as 1 year. I thought doing a 50-50 blend of those two measurements, wage growth and inflation, and then subtracting a point. And the subtraction of the point comes with this idea of how are we bending the healthcare one at a different rate. So that would result in 3.75% as the suggested target value. And then I think that does need to be reconsidered on some cadence. I don't think it should be annually. I agree with the last time this was set, that having it set for some amount of time allows for some planning in advance. Although I do find this idea of triggers interesting. But I definitely agree. Charlie gave mention to this about like we have a series of reasonable and quite a few exemptions from the cost growth target that I think allow space for some of the program tried to allow space for unknowns. And so I think it does have some reflection of that. And then I had one other point that I'm totally blanking on, but that's our proposal. We do a 50-50 blend minus 1 point to get this number. And Charlotte also, 36% increase in healthcare premiums is unconscionable.
Agree. There's no way
I
of
remember
getting
what it was. Is that like the healthcare cost target or growth target was never meant to be like the one tool. It's not, it does not solve, it does not get us where we need to go by itself. It was meant to spur collaboration and change. And so I don't know that it's been super successful at that thus far. It feels like we're doing the same thing and then being like, this doesn't work under this growth target. And so, I don't know how we get back to being like, we need to address things in a portfolio of change, not just this one.
Kristen, thanks for talking through that. I have a clarifying question about the proposal. When you say the 1 point reduction, is that a 1 percentage point from what the 50-50 formula, or is that something else?
Yeah, it's because of the use of percentage and stuff. So I think of it as 1 point. So if we're just doing 50-50 of those two blends over 5 years, that is 4.75. I'm saying we minus 1 point, so it becomes 3.75.
Thank you. All right, work group. Questions, reflections, reactions to proposal 2. Deb.
I guess I have a really, really hard time with any of the numbers we've been talking about so far because of exactly what Charlotte talked about. They got a 30 whatever percentage of increase, and yet the same company is only offering a 3.4% increase in reimbursement because of cost growth target. So that tells me they're just playing games. And I feel like it's the same all over. My small clinic, ours was 20% an increase this year. So instead of paying 20% more, which we cannot afford, we had to go with a higher deductible. Who's the winner there? Nobody. So how are small providers or any providers supposed to fight with this, or not fight, but get through this if the people with all the money are still trying to suck it out of the system and there doesn't seem to be an equal application of the rules? So if they're not allowed to pay more than 3.4%, then they shouldn't be allowed to charge more than 3.4%, but that's blatantly not happening anywhere. So I guess I thought this program was supposed to be applied equally to everyone in healthcare, and it's just not. So if we're not going to apply it equally to everyone, we've got to talk about completely changing the formula. 3.4 doesn't even get me to our increased expenses. We are employers. We are patients. We are providers. We are all of what we're trying to help here in my small clinic, and we are all losing this battle. So I don't have an answer, but I'm pretty frustrated with the way it seems to be. Okay, you guys can do it this way. You guys can do it that way. I guess we don't really care what you do over there. That just can't continue if we're going to try and find any sort of system that helps decrease costs. Because if insurance companies keep going up 20, 30, 40%, then patients are going to have to pay higher deductibles because no employer can afford to go up that much every year. So it doesn't matter what happens in your provider's office, other than patients getting angry at us because their bill that we send them is bigger because their deductible is bigger. And we have no way to combat that. So I guess how do we factor that in to
Yeah.
this discussion?
Yeah, Deb, I want to just thank you for that, and Charlotte as well for sharing the personal example. I think it's really helpful to provide context to any percentages that we're talking about. So I do just want to clarify that the cost growth target implementation, there is no restriction on payers, on carriers that says they cannot offer more than a 3.4% rate increase. We are measuring payer cost growth in aggregate. And I believe the original assumption and the original plan was that it would average out, and that some providers may be receiving higher rates, some lower rates, but not that it was a 3.4% at a contract level cap. If that's how it's showing up in negotiations, I think that's maybe a different conversation. And, I know we have some payer representatives on the call today, if any of you would like to chime in here, but I do just want to be very clear that when we're talking about it being applied, that's not coming from the state level. There is no directive that contracts must be capped at 3.4%. I see a few more comments in the chat on the provider side. But pausing, Paul, Tara, anyone on the plan side want to comment here?
I'm happy to talk a little, and Paul, see if you want to as well. This is outside of the space I'm in regularly. I'm happy to take it back and ask the question specifically, but I also don't want to look like we're hiding from anything in the conversation. I know these increases are hard on us too, right? We're also employers and consumers of healthcare and individuals in this system as well. I can say for our health plan, I mean, we've operated at a loss for years and have been trying to change that this year. Part of the negotiation that our provider contracting team is bringing cost growth into those conversations to say, this is what the state has for what growth should look like. For us to try to get there, we need to start having this as part of that conversation and have it a relevant piece of those negotiations. And we're having those conversations here too. But when we look at our membership last year, utilization was just so high. The needs, the demands to be able to meet what the population needed was significant and more than we expected. And it left us in a place where we had to do significant rate increases and had to justify those to our regulator in order to get those approved. And these were hard to put out into the market. and and I say it's hard on you as an organization, it's hard on us as an organization too. This is what healthcare is costing. This isn't, we're creating extra margins at the health plan. We're really limited on what margins can look like. And so we're in a space where I think a part of this program, the reason we're all here is to try to figure out what are the drivers of healthcare cost and what can we do from various vantage points to try to start addressing some of those. And I think this challenge that I wrestle with this program is it creates this one-to-one relationship where it doesn't give us a space where we're working as a team to find those issues, to figure out how to address those issues together. Rate negotiation is a hard place to have those conversations, but I think that's where they're being had. It would be nice in forums like this if we can start having some of those conversations too. Those are my thoughts off the top of my head. So I appreciate the opportunity to respond.
Thanks, Tara. Paul, and then I want to maybe redirect the conversation a little bit, but please go ahead.
Yep, and so I'll speak to some of the just so Paul from Regents, um, speaking to what's public in our rate filings. Just that big piece here is pharmacy. Cost growth there is easily 20%, depending on the line of business. Just the unit cost agreements we have are over 5%. As Tara mentioned, we've seen a lot of utilization. That's 4 to 5%. And that some of this gets into the acuity argument of it's one piece to have provider costs go up, but sort of the expectation is that utilization will not go up then. And that doesn't necessarily put us in a great place either. And so just from some of the other points that have been made, the target of 3.4 or 4 or probably even 5, having the target on its own doesn't change the behavior, doesn't change sort of the challenges we face in Oregon. It is trying to find that, how do we use all of this data and information that we've gathered to do something different, to figure out what that piece is. And I think, again, broader to what we're here for today, but that's like sort of the challenge of this program, like how to turn this information into something new. But in the meantime, we're all sort of reacting to the target itself and sort of being very focused on ourselves within in that narrow space.
Thanks for that, Paul. I think there are some really um, smart and reflective comments today, and I want to acknowledge that um, you're bringing up some great points and like where do some of these conversations go? And I think they probably need to continue beyond this 5 meeting series, and I really welcome that. I want to agree with some of the previous comments about maybe we've stalled out on where those collaborative spaces are. I think there's a lot of tension, and I've heard a lot in just the last 3 weeks about we don't want you to tell us what to do. We do want you to tell us what to do. We don't want you to convene us. We do want you to convene us. And so I think there's some mixed opinions out there. I hear today that maybe there's more desire to create some of those collaborative spaces. I think that's not necessarily, I don't think everyone necessarily in the cost growth target program is in agreement about that. And I want to just acknowledge that. So I also think that this is something that maybe there's some opportunity to have conversations with the policy board. Maybe there are some other third parties, total whiplash, who want to think about being in that convening space. We have had some convening, some collaborative efforts. There's been all the work with the Primary Care Payment Reform Collaborative, which I believe the policy board is looking at relaunching some primary care work in 2026. There is also all of the work that has really sort of wrapped up around value-based payment. And so I think if there are some other emerging topics that are really ripe for payer-provider collaboration, let's talk about it. Let's figure out what they are. Let's figure out what we want from that. I just want to recognize that I don't think everybody necessarily wants that. So that said, can we take that aside? And if people have comments about collaboration, like feel free to send those in and we'll work on that on the side and figure out where to channel that. I really appreciate that. I think I want to speak to maybe, Paul, what you said really resonated with me about like we're getting fixated on the number. Like it's hard to get past sort of the fear of the number because, as you've all pointed out, there is accountability. We are in a world where there are lots of outs, there are lots of off ramps before any payers and providers are held accountable for cost growth. And we're trying to retain as much of that flexibility because of all the uncertainties and all the things that are outside of any individual payer and provider's control. But coming back to the purpose of this meeting, at the end of the day, we do want to have a target because there is value in having a predictable, in having, and when I say predictable, I mean we know what the target is. We can plan ahead towards that target. Um, and I think there was real value that the group in 2020 set the target for 10 years. And I would really strongly encourage you to consider what you want to recommend and how that provides any stability for contract negotiation, how that provides stability for other planning. So I think there's value there. Stop. Um, Second point in response, I do think a question for you all, and maybe let's pause here for some discussion. We currently have one target statewide. That was the original recommendation, same target for all lines of business. I think if you wanted to recommend a separate target for each market, you are welcome to do that. I don't know what OHA would do with that yet. I'm not going to overpromise anything, but I do think that if you feel as a work group that that's a valid recommendation and you think it's worth unpacking that, then let's do that. And we have a 1.5 meetings left. I don't know that we have a concrete number yet, so let's think about, is it a formula but then scaled differently for each market? Like, are you tripling the amount of work that you have left for yourself? But I think if that's a recommendation that you want to pursue, I don't think that's necessarily out of scope. All right, I'm going to stop there. Daniel.
Thanks, Sarah. Daniel Porter, Legacy Health. I think it makes a lot of sense to have three different targets, but considering how difficult it is to get one target, I think it may be beyond what we can achieve, right? If there were clear indicators that we could all agree on that we could follow and apply to each of those, I would find that sort of more of a hopeful proposition. But I think like let's try to get to one first and then go from there. And I do think it needs to be a balance of what's happening with consumers and wages and affordability. So I like the median wage growth. I think I'd prefer historical rather than projected. I do think we also need to have something that factors in healthcare expenditures. And I've considered the arguments around, perverse incentives, and it's I couldn't say to my leadership, we're going to increase expenses today in the hopes that we can not be penalized in the future. It just wouldn't be a compelling argument, especially if we're using like a national healthcare expenditure number. As I think about like inflation, it's often tied to specific services, and that totally ignores most of the utilization component. Maybe there's a health share or a health insurance component to medical CPI, but it's going to be small. And so if utilization is increasing or the intensity of services is increasing, it's not necessarily reflected in inflation. And I think all of us could point to our financials and show that the expenses have risen much more than any sort of measure of inflation, whether that's medical or otherwise. So my recommendation would be we have a 50-50 split of an expenditure metric and a affordability wage growth metric. And I would not try to ramp it back down over those 5 years or cut some percentage off it. If we can stay in our current situation and not make things worse, keep escalating, I think that's a victory, a great place to start, rather than artificially applying some percentage. I think the affordability wage piece adds the aspirational component that the program was intended to have, right? And try to recognize that.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to call what you just said proposal 3. I'm not looking at the spreadsheet to see what the math shakes out to with a 50-50 blend of that, but I think I heard you say 50-50 median wage, historic, and healthcare expenditure metric, possibly national healthcare expenditures. Is that an accurate summation? Okay, I saw you nod. Okay, James, and then if anyone has comments, reflections, or questions on Daniel's third proposal.
Thanks, Sarah. Very quickly, just on Daniel's proposal, I like the compromise blend of wages and health expenditure utilization. And nothing's going to be perfect, but I think it's setting us in the right direction for us to consider. But I wanted to add one comment on your 10-year stability target, and I understand the sentiment there, and I wish we lived in a world that had 10 years of certainty ahead of us. And I think the stalking horse to all of this is HR1 and what impact that's going to have on Medicaid coverage in Oregon. Clearly, there's a lot less money coming to cover those Medicaid folks, and all of us as providers are very concerned about it. The people in our community aren't going to go away. They just either won't have Medicaid or Medicaid won't have enough dollars to cover them. And that, the way the American healthcare system is designed right now, will put tremendous pressure on commercial contracts and commercial reimbursement to try and cobble together enough money to take care of your entire community. And for that reason alone, I worry about setting a very long-term target. I think it has to be nimble to reflect this unfortunate reality that's facing us. Thanks.
Thanks. Typing and trying to get off mute. James, appreciate that. Charlie.
Oh, sorry. I think I just think that there has to be some attempt to, you know, create a delta between healthcare costs and uh, people's wages or whatever the metric we choose is. I don't think we can just go with wage growth and try to keep it that because I mean the status quo isn't working for people. The status quo as it currently stands, um, if nothing changes, has some people paying as much as $500 more per month in premiums than they were going to be this year. And so that just isn't working for people. And I think if the proposal is just to keep at that status quo, then it's not we're not achieving what we want to achieve. So I think any proposal has to bend the cost curve and have some sort of reduction from whatever the current proposed line or what the historical trend has been. If this program is going to achieve what it's intended to achieve, which is to change the status quo of healthcare that just costs too much for people in Oregon.
Thanks, Charlie. Okay, I'm seeing a couple of comments in the chat. Folks in the chat, do any of you want to repeat or elaborate on any of this verbally? Hang on 2 seconds, Sierra, see if anyone else in the chat wants to jump in first. All right, let's go Sierra, then Melissa.
Yeah, absolutely. Just want to echo support for what Daniel had to share. That's also reflected in the Hospital Association's comments that are available in the meeting materials. Thank you for posting that, Sarah. And then also, I just thought that it would be helpful as we are getting into a position of discussing specific numbers and what it looks like to actually bend the curve for the state of Oregon. I really did just want to bring into the conversation once again the most recent reporting from OHA on the growth in total healthcare expenditures for the state. And so for 2023, I'm looking at the report that includes the payer information. That percentage was 5.2%. So I just wanted to share that. I think it's helpful for also framing the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks for sharing. Melissa.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I really am reflective on what Charlotte said and dealing with the same thing and thinking about, and sitting on the cost growth committee previously, we didn't talk a lot about cost shift, but that is kind of fundamentally a piece of the healthcare system in this country. And as we see, the likelihood and the expectation around Medicaid rate cuts, even having that discussion, I think this year with the CCOs as they're trying to right size themselves as a provider, thinking about what we see from the federal level related to Medicare, and just straight Medicare fee for service payments and those fluctuating every year, it does put a lot of pressure on the commercial market. I've had a conversation with a payer, a national payer, who is like, I'm not sure I should be doing business in Oregon providing healthcare because it's so expensive. And it's like shocking to have that conversation, right? Because, commercial business should be good business. But though that's the reality kind of nationally when others are looking at the state compared to others with what's not funded from the governmental lens and the cost of what it is to provide care. The sensitivity of the the where our healthcare sits and the trade-offs related to this, I just think is super important for us to think about in the next few years, given how delicate the healthcare system is. And I know many of the comments set reflected that. So I just appreciate, I guess, the sensitive, how this conversation has moved along. I appreciate the thought about the differences between the lines of business. And thinking about, though complex, we are asking one line of business to pay for underfunding of other lines of business, even if we would like cost to be at what Medicare pays or what Medicaid pays. I think we all understand that's not actuarially the case with our cost model. And unfortunately, in the state, just a comment, Medicare does not pay at rates in Oregon that it pays in other parts of the country. So we actually have more pressure in Oregon than, say, in Florida or other parts of the country where Medicare does pay at a higher rate, and they've got a lower cost structure for cost of living, which we're all familiar with. So just, I'm not really adding a whole lot other than to say appreciate the thoughtfulness of the discussion, concerned about kind of looking at this too long into the future. So I would agree, no more than 5 years as a recommendation, and really considering separate targets by line of business, reflecting the nature of the funding model and the differences there and what we do and don't have control over. I am supportive of.
Thanks, Melissa. Appreciate that. Okay. We have about 20, 25 minutes left in this conversation. I want to see, and I really want to defer to you because I think we're actually really getting to some really important content, and I am hearing some consistencies. I don't know that there's a full agreement on maybe a recommendation emerging, but I do think we're getting there. So let me ask you a couple questions and then let you decide where you want to go. So we could sort of pause and take a light vote on the three proposals on the table and see if one of them is rising to the top. We could see if there are proposals 4 or 5 or any variations to add to the mix for consideration. I can summarize back where I'm hearing that there might be some alignment across the proposals and see if that is our foundation for a recommendation. What do you all think would be helpful? Kirsten and then Tara.
Just because I do so much better reading something, did I hear someone say that proposal 3 was inside someone's comments, written comments that were posted?
It was in Daniel's verbal comments.
And well, yeah, I heard that, but I thought I didn't. Okay, but so it's only been said verbally. I thought I heard someone say it was reflective of a written one, but
Yeah, I can clarify. The hospital association submitted comments and had language in there to that the target should consider national health expenditures, utilization, and median wage growth. However, there is not a specific formula in our
okay.
comments.
Thanks for I had misunderstood that. Thanks, here.
The Oregon Health Leadership Council also submitted comments with similar kind of principles around looking at both kinds of indicators and weighting it. But again, like the Hospital Association, we didn't have a specific formula in mind, just suggestions at a guiding principle level.
Other thoughts about process? Actually, let me recap where I think I'm hearing. I'm hearing that there's some strong interest in a blended formula that takes into account median wage and some sort of economic indicator that reflects healthcare costs. I'm hearing that there's some agreement that 5 years, not longer than 5 years, but 5 years with either maybe triggers or some process to revisit more frequently because not everybody is totally comfortable with 5 years. Does anyone completely disagree with those points? Does that not reflect any of the alignment yet? Tara, then Kirsten.
Hey, thanks, Sarah. Um, I like what I'm hearing with wage plus cost, figuring out what those factors are and some kind of blended outcome. And then the other pieces that I want to take back and spend some time with is what that looks like for line of business, where the cost piece maybe differs by line of business, while the wage piece is probably going to be static.
Okay, yes. And I should have said that. I think there is interest in line of business. Um, and for what it's worth, as like I'm kind of gonna wear both hats. So like as staffing your work group right now, you could totally say OHA should figure out how to do this as part of your recommendation, if that is the recommendation. Kirsten, I cut you off. Please go ahead.
No problem. I recognize in a mine probably a smaller group of this group. So like I don't, you know, I think we should proceed. I will say that like I don't agree with using a measurement based on healthcare costs. Because I think a lot of that is reflected in the reasonability of determinations already. And the exclusions already are a lot based on healthcare expenses. And I think that the statute of this and the purpose of this program is not to base growth as influenced by past performance. So I disagree with that trajectory. That might not be a popular opinion. I do like the 5 years. And on
And sorry,
having
actually,
different,
Kirsten, sorry, can I pause you? Because in
yeah,
your proposal too, you are also suggesting a blend with a general inflation, just not a healthcare
yes,
specific.
yes,
Okay.
yeah. So it's a healthcare specific measurement that I not in favor of. I don't mind a blend. Um, I like the 5 years. I have questions if we start to set, if this committee was to suggest to OHA that we should have different numbers for different lines of business, my mind starts to be like, well, what happens when the state raises rates, Medicaid rates, like they just did, or if Medicare rates went up. Anyway, it leads my mind to all sorts of triggers than just thinking about consumers from that perspective. So it gets complicated, but I understand why people are saying that.
Thanks. Charlie.
Kirsten, maybe it's not popular with the whole group, but I think it's popular with me. I don't think I agree that including healthcare costs in the cost growth is not really appropriate, given all of the outs to that incorporate those already in the reasonableness standard. And then I guess I would also just reiterate my not complete objection to, but I think pretty serious concerns with some sort of trigger to reevaluate the target again, given that there's so many considerations within the reasonableness determination already that take those into account. And at the very least, if that was included, there would have to be something also to ratchet the target down. If, for example, the wage growth was significantly lower than projected, like then there would have to be something that lowers the target by a percentage point or two to account for that. And so that just seems like opening a can of worms that is overly complicated and uh, in some ways redundant. Um, so I think that's the other thing that I would add.
Thanks, Charlie. I want to see, I know some work group members are listening in and haven't yet chimed in on this conversation. I will call you by name, but does anyone else want to uh, reflect or speak to any of the three proposals currently on the table? Denise, I see your comment in the chat. I might ask you to come off mute and say more. Are you suggesting that in the blended indicator, um, include a measure of healthcare costs, but at a lower weight rather than a 50-50 split, which addresses maybe some of the concerns that Kristen and Charlie are raising? Am I interpreting your comment correctly? Yes. Okay. Kristen and Charlie, any reflections or thoughts on if the measure included healthcare cost but at a lower weight? Does that change your position at all? Okay, if not.
I mean, I initially know, like it seems like the concept of accounting for something twice is the problem. And we're accounting for it already in a lot of the things that are in the reasonable standard. So I mean, that's my just initial reaction without having thought about it very much.
Okay, thanks. Brian, fantastic comment. Yes, let us remind everyone about the process for determining reasonableness. So, the process. OHA collects, validates the data, determines each payer and provider's cost growth relative to the target. That includes the statistical testing with the confidence intervals. And so some payers and providers have a finding of indeterminate cost growth. That is, we cannot say with statistical confidence, you exceeded the cost growth target. The process, the conversation ends there. For all payers and providers who have exceeded the cost growth target with statistical confidence, OHA sends a notice and says you need to participate in the reasonableness process with us for this measurement period for these markets. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's two or three. The next step is a meeting. In that meeting, OHA shares what we know about cost growth and what the drivers are and potential reasons, and we ask questions. These conversations have gone really differently depending on who we talk to, payers and providers. We've tried to retain maximum flexibility here. There's no sort of standard form. Sometimes we have one conversation and then we say, oh, it was this. Great. Here's some documentation we need. Send it over email and we're done. Sometimes it's more complicated and we have a series of meetings. Sometimes the payer provider goes back and does some additional analysis. Sometimes we get to those meetings and the payer and provider says, we've prepared a presentation for you. Let us tell you all of the things that are going on. And that's really helpful. So the way I've been thinking about this, and this is maybe a newer framing, I don't know that we've really like put this out in messaging, but in that reasonableness conversation, we're looking for three things. We're looking for data, like what is the actual dollar amount that we're talking about, the PMPM, the amount over the target. We're looking for that narrative explanation, like what's the context? So, okay, these many dollars in contract increases. Who was the contract to? What was the payment for? Why did it increase so much this year? Like, explain that narrative. And then does it connect to one of those acceptable reasons for cost growth? And so sometimes we get one of those things very initially up front, very easy. Sometimes we have to dig a little bit more to get to all three. Sometimes we don't get all three, and that's where we find the not reasonable determination. So Brian, to your specific question, what do they have to submit? It really varies. We don't have a specific template that says fill out this form to prove your reasonableness. It starts with a conversation, and then depending on that conversation, the documentation has really varied. Sometimes entities provide a really long memo. Sometimes it's a spreadsheet. Sometimes we ask for very specific data. It's been pretty flexible. Does that help? Does anyone who's been through this process want to provide any additional context? Okay. Is there anyone who would like to put a fourth proposal on the table? I think we have three, maybe like three and a half, because there's a variation with Denise's weighting proposal.
Hey, Sarah, it's Russ. Sorry, I didn't raise my hand, but no
Yeah,
one
go
was
ahead,
talking.
Russ.
I know you're taking comments until November 30th. Should we contemplate that before, could there be something else showing up before November 30th that we need to take into account before reacting to these three and a half proposals?
Yeah, so here's what I was thinking process-wise. I would like this group to get to a recommendation that you're going to make to OHA, and that will land in the last meeting. The last meeting is before November 30th. There's a non-zero chance that not all workgroup members or all payers and providers and advocates that are paying attention to this conversation will agree with the recommendation and may want to submit comment to OHA separately. And so the reason we're saying till November 30th is to make space for anything that comes in addition to the workgroup recommendation, and then OHA will take that in making the final decision.
Okay, thank you.
Charlie.
Well, I'm just going to throw out a proposal that I think should be on the table for consideration. And that's just leaving the target at 3% like it was originally planned. My thinking here is I'm looking at the reasonableness determinations over the last year, and 3 out of I don't know the exact number, but it looks like 20 or 25 uh, payers were determined to be over the target without a reasonable basis in the most recent year, and 2 provider organizations out of 30 plus. And to me, that seems like about what you would expect, or maybe even fewer than you would expect if really we're bending the cost curve. So part of me wants to say, it seems like not that many entities are actually exceeding it for a reasonable basis, and therefore, or for not for a reasonable basis, and therefore will be subject to accountability measures. And like that seems like a relative pretty small percentage of the total amount of entities that are in the program, which is about what you would expect if it's, taking into account all of the things that need to be taken into account in order to determine whether accountability should happen. And so maybe the right course of action is to actually ratchet it down a little bit to continue to achieve that kind of goal. So I don't. I want to, given that we are putting out proposals, and that's kind of what statutorily was envisioned originally. I just think we'd be remiss if we didn't have that as a proposal that's on the table for consideration.
Thanks, Charlie. Original 3.0% as initially set by the Cost Growth Target Implementation Committee as proposal number 4. Larry, I'm going to come to your comment in a second, but does anyone want to react or ask questions or respond to Charlie's proposal 4? Larry, go ahead.
Yeah, hopefully y'all can hear me. And sorry for not being on camera. My network's being a little iffy right now. And I appreciate that, Charlie. I mean, I think that's obviously where we're at today, and absolutely does need to be considered. I think the one thing after I've heard this conversation today, though, is I think we do need to be respectful of the concerns that we've heard around, is there a perverse incentive with regards to contract negotiations that is leveraged with just maintaining that 3%? That doesn't maybe address the underlying issue with regards to provider and payer negotiations, if that is truly an issue within some or part or some or all of the system.
Thanks, Larry. James?
Hey, sorry to speak up again. Just you asked about Charlie's proposal, and I appreciate that. I'm here representing Salem Health, which is a large provider of primary care as well as hospital care in our community. So obviously, I have a maybe a unique perspective compared to some others. I know there's a reluctance to think about an inclusion of the cost of providing care in the formula, and I understand the driver behind it. But there is also a reality here that the escalating costs of there is a shortage of doctors, there is a shortage of nurses, there is a shortage of other healthcare workers in Oregon. What that means is providers have to pay market competitive wages to be able to recruit providers to Oregon and keep them here. And that unfortunately drives costs. Those costs aren't passed on to Medicaid. They are not passed on to Medicare. They're only passed on to commercial providers. And if we continue to set an arbitrary disconnected target of 3.4% or 3% or ratchet down even lower, I think, Sarah, you put on one of your first slides a comment from somebody about unintended consequences. We really have to think carefully about the unintended consequences of cheap healthcare, but not enough for anybody to access. And that is the dangerous path we set ourselves down if we don't factor into those other input costs. I recognize how unpopular they are. That was my only comment. Thanks.
Thanks, James. And please don't apologize for multiple comments here. We're having some really good discussion today. Sierra, hold on just a second. I do want to remind everybody that we do have a statutorily added reason for cost growth, and that is frontline workforce costs. That applies only on the provider side. I know payers don't love that, but on the provider side, frontline workforce costs are an acceptable reason for cost growth. And I think if folks haven't seen the report we put out at the end of October that looked at the first year of data collection on that, most of the growth is actually, at least for 22, 23, was in non-frontline workforce costs. So I'm not arguing your point at all, James. I'm just saying we have some nuanced data that maybe can help inform that conversation.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, there's caps on what's included, and the salary caps seem reasonable until you consider, every physician in Oregon makes more than 200 grand. You can't run a hospital without an anesthesiologist. You can't recruit an anesthesiologist and pay them less than 200 grand. So unfortunately, the carve-outs do exclude some huge economic drivers for health systems like ours.
Thanks. All right, Sierra. Sierra, you're on mute.
Thank you. I'd like to respond to the fourth proposal. The Hospital Association would oppose lowering the cost growth target to 3%. And looking at the trend of the data that we have for statewide performance, it is trending upwards, 3.5%, 4.8%, 5.2%. And so I think until there is some demonstration that as a state we're even able to meet what we currently have, I think that lowering it is out of the question.
Thanks for that. Okay, it's 4:18. Let me propose a couple of options for next steps. Larry, I totally agree. My brain also works better when everything's on paper, ideally in a matrix. I love a matrix. What I would like to propose, and I am really open to your feedback about the best way to move this forward. I'm happy to write up the four proposals and send them out. I kind of want to put them out in like a shared Google document so you all can comment um, and make additional arguments or positions. I don't necessarily want to go for a vote because I don't think it's super helpful or productive to just say, like, let's do majority vote and call it right now. But I do think maybe if we do a shared document with all the proposals, if folks would be willing to sort of like sign your name to the proposal you are in most support of, or with any notes, so we can get a sense of do we have agreement? Is there a recommendation emerging? And I understand wanting to see it written before committing. Does that sound helpful? I mean, there's a lot of folks. Shared document editing can be hard. Does that seem helpful? Is there an alternate suggestion for moving the conversation forward between now and meeting 5?
I think that
I
makes
think it'd be
sense.
super helpful if you.
Quick question. Is the outcome, does it have to be just a single recommendation, or can it be like an array of, hey, these are possible options that, you know, groups here on this call could support or may support?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's up to you if you feel comfortable with that. I mean, I had always been open to like maybe we'd have a majority recommendation and a minority opinion. But I think if you want to put forward multiple recommendations for OHA's consideration, okay.
Okay.
Um, struggle with Google Docs. Yeah, if you've got a different platform, that would be great. Okay, Keaton and then Sierra. Ranked choice voting.
Oh yeah, I just saw that ranked choice voting. My game theorist in here always wants to say, hey, look, the more information you collect about preferences, the easier it is to construct the social preference. But one thing I want to highlight is that I think one of the big differences that has emerged in sort of classifying these proposals is how what people view as the appropriateness of including healthcare industry indicators directly into the measure. And I think there is value in a process that gauges the group's views on that issue alone, independently of how you would execute or determine a cost growth target conditional on the answer to that thing. So, for example, like I have not been swayed yet by the arguments for using these. I think I am open to those arguments, to the possibility of that, but I have not yet, been brought over to that side. However, if I knew for sure that this group had, super majority support for, including like that's just got to be part of the equation for this group to form a recommendation. That's something that I could think about and make changes to my own thing. And, my overall philosophy here is that I want to try to do something that pushes the conversation forward. So knowing that the level of support for that independently of other things would be useful for me at least.
Okay. I can propose something in a minute on that, but Sierra first, please.
Yeah, I just I'm thinking about the possibility of working in a Google Doc with 35 people, and it does sound a little bit overwhelming and messy. And so, just Sarah, any parameters that you put around that I think would be helpful, just especially for the hospital association and the way that we engage with our members. I think it would be maybe hard for us to do much in a Google Doc space. Definitely want to see all the proposals in writing, though. But I think I encourage you to have some guardrails around that. And also, the hospital association might choose to respond in a different format if that doesn't work for our process well.
Okay, let me try a new proposal. Appreciate you all iterating with me. I love Keaton's suggestion of let's get a vote on that specific question. So how about this? I will send out a poll tomorrow with that specific question and a summary of the four proposals, 4.5 proposals on the table. I will not set up a shared document for editing. I think let's look at Kirsten's suggestion of ranked choice voting, so that people can see the proposals. And then we'll do a ranked choice vote as a pulse check with an open text comment before meeting 5, so that we can come to meeting 5 with here's where we are. This is not to say that more proposals can't be added to the table, but I'd ask, are they significantly different? At this point, do we really just have the 4 proposals and we're going from there? And that doesn't mean we can't tweak them, but does that make sense? So gut check on the question of including healthcare costs in the indicator directly. Summary of the proposals, send those out tomorrow, and then next week push out like a ranked choice survey for work group members. Feel free to continue to provide comment or additional information to accompany that, and we'll package all that up for meeting 5. And the goal to report back out on meeting 5 is where we landed on that voting, and then where you all want to go from there. Whether that's one recommendation, multiple recommendations, majority versus minority opinions. I saw a bunch of thumbs up. Can everybody live with that proposal? Does anybody feel unheard and need something different? Okay, great. I have some next steps. You all have some next steps. I'll get that email out to you all tomorrow. Again, thank you so much for everyone who put forward a proposal. That was really helpful for this conversation. And I think there was some really excellent, thoughtful discussion today. So I just appreciate everyone's time in this group. Please feel free to keep sending comments. And if you want to flag, if you want them shared with the whole group, or if they're more for OHA, that would be great. And I think we'll call it there. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
You.